You were talking yesterday, and this came up about the analog, about the tapes. It is sometimes cumbersome. It is a hassle, and the reason why you do it surprised me because I was one of the people who thought, oh, it's got a warm sound. Maybe that's why he does it. Could you share with people why you go through?
Well, I have been in the practice of making records for a long time, so I have seen a lot of changes sort of roll through the recording business. And starting in the 1980s, there was a kind of a frenzy about things eventually becoming digital, because it seemed like that was like an inevitable thing, and also like an aspiration. It was a goal to eventually make everything digital. But at that point, every time there was a digital technological development, it had associated with it some sort of proprietary system. So like this digital tape machine couldn't play anybody else's digital tapes. It could only play its own. And then that company stopped making that tape machine, and those tapes became orphans, and then you couldn't play them anywhere. And that happened again and again and again and again. There's a long list of expired digital formats that are now essentially useless, where if you had put your life's work on that format, it would now be gone forever, right? And then when digital workstations replaced the tape-based version of digital recording, there was some prospect that could solve that problem. But all of the digital workstations maintain this notion of proprietary technology. So if you have a workstation from one software company, it might be able to open a session from somebody else's software company, somebody else's format. It might not. If there are plugins and other things that are associated with that session, those may not survive. If you have an older session that's on some kind of a storage medium, it could be on a DVD or on a hard drive or on a thumb drive or whatever it's on, then if you want to mount that session in the future, you need to have a means of accessing that, like your new computer system needs to be able to play those, needs to be able to mount that storage medium, yeah. Which is not a given anymore. In fact, there's a fairly rapid acceleration in obsolescence of these things. And it used to be that every computer had a CD slot, or before that a floppy disk drive, and that's not the case anymore. And the interconnection protocols and all these sorts of things, none of these things are static in the computer world. And so computer recording is a very fragile thing in a temporal sense, in the sense of something surviving for a very long period of time. And my life has been enriched by music that happened a long time ago and was recorded, and I was able to hear it. And so I feel a heavy responsibility for the bands that I record, a lot of whom are not popular, or the majority of whom are not popular and don't have an audience at the moment. I feel an obligation to them to make a recording that will survive long enough to eventually find an audience. And I've been doing it long enough that I have already seen, the silver anniversary special editions of some records that I've worked on have come out, and that was possible because the master tapes survived and the original recordings were done in a way that allowed them to be reinvigorated with the advances in audio reproduction, for example, that we have now. In the 80s and 90s, CD technology was sort of a compact disc was about as good as digital audio got, 16 bits, 44.1 kilohertz. And, metering and other digital tools didn't really exist to optimize that format even. So there were quite a few records that were released in that early digital CD format, which is a fairly compromised format. And if those master tapes have survived, they could be released now in a much higher resolution format, provided they had an analog master, which is much higher resolution than a digital master, provided they had an analog master. They could be released now in a format with much greater resolution than their original commercial release.
Okay.
And, songs that were never released at all, for example, could be released as bonus material. And again, that depends on the original session material surviving in a way that allows that to, it's just, I feel like the principal job of a recording engineer shouldn't be the magic show that you do in the studio where like, check out what I did to the guitar, that's not the job. The job is to make a recording so that in the future somebody can listen to what this band was doing and know what they were all about. And since that's the most important part of the job, I feel like that's the one part that I can't compromise on. Like the part where in 50 years, an old man can go to the shelf and take out his master tape and say, I made a record and here it is. Would you like to hear it? And I feel like that's the part of the job that I just can't budge on, the part that makes it permanent.
Preservation.
I have heard literally every argument that the digital domain is not as fragile as I profess it to be, right? Mm-hmm. But as a working audio professional, I have to contend with the problems that this technological development has generated. I have to contend with those problems on an almost daily basis. And I keep getting reinforcement that I've done the safest, best thing by keeping everything in an open format where anyone in the world can play any tape that I've made on any machine of any vintage and hear what the band was doing when they made their record. And that's not true of any digital format up to this point. It isn't the case that anyone with a computer can play any digital session.
You probably have to do some remixing. You can't recall everything.
Well, it's not just remixing. It's just the notion that in a lot of digital sessions, there is no final master tape. There's just like a series of edits and manipulations that has stopped at a certain point, right? And that's where the session is. So if you lose all of that because none of the edits or the edit decision list doesn't survive, or because the software that you were using that company went out of business, and computer technology uses different storage media or whatever. If you lose that, you can't just resurrect the original source material, because the original source material is essentially meaningless. It's millions of uncoordinated audio files, some fractions of a second long, that are completely unmanageable. And you'll see when we go through the master tape here, like this session that the Subsurfer session was a 16-track session, which is, for my taste, perfectly adequate for a straightforward combo recording. But it could have been a 24-track session. But you'll see that everything is fairly simply laid out, and if you just open the box and take the tape out and look at the documentation, you can tell what everything is and how it's supposed to behave. So
would you then be, like, let's say you're stuck with digital, would you then be an advocate for printing stems out as soon as you finish, like it's declared finished? Because it's like fewer proprietary. I
don't have any advice for digital engineers, because I'm not one, and I don't presume to be able to tell them how to do their jobs. I think this is a problem that anyone who's been in the game long enough to see certain things expire recognizes. It's an unspoken problem. Like, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge it, and there is a kind of a fragility to what everyone is doing now that I think is not being acknowledged. So obviously, I think the solution is to work in the analog domain, to make multi-track masters on tape and make stereo masters on tape. And I think that's my solution. That's how I've resolved that. So if someone is working in the digital domain, I don't really have any advice, because I have been prevented from working in the digital domain because of this fundamental problem that I don't see a solution to.
That's fair.
I mean, it suits me because I'm profoundly lazy and I don't want to learn anything new. So it suits me that I've solved the problem in this fashion. But if there were some way that I could get over that hurdle, my life would be a lot easier if I just did records on a computer like everybody else. From a practical day-to-day standpoint, my life would be easier. I wouldn't have to worry about keeping inventory of tape. I wouldn't have to worry about the condition of the machines. And if someone says, do you want to come to my studio, I wouldn't have to spend 40 hours of prep work getting everything ready and ship 2 cases of materials to prepare for the session. My life would be easier on the whole if I could get beyond this hurdle of the temporary nature of digital recordings. But I have thought about it from every angle, and every time there's an interruption in the tape supply, or every time there's like a change in the industry, I feel obliged to re-examine the issue, and the solution, unfortunately, has still been the same for me, is that I'm going to make records on tape until I can't make records on tape anymore. So.